Lieutenant Commander Kyle Reeves's voice cut across the crowded VFW hall like a blade meant to draw blood. "Hey, old-timer, which war were you in? The Spanish-American?" His men laughed on cue, the sound sharp and cruel in the Memorial Day gathering. The old man at the corner table did not look up. His hands, scarred across the knuckles and steady as stone, continued cutting his meat loaf into precise squares. Each cut identical, each movement economical. The kind of precision that comes from decades of training most men could not survive. What Reeves did not know, what nobody in that hall knew, was that in exactly 15 minutes he would be standing at attention with tears streaming down his face, apologizing to a ghost. The VFW Post 847 had hosted Memorial Day gatherings for 47 years. The walls held photographs of young men who never grew old, flags folded into triangles, shadow boxes displaying medals that cost more than metal to earn. Tonight the hall was packed with active duty SEALs from the nearby base, retired operators with silver in their beards, and families who had learned to hold their loved ones loosely. The smell of institutional meatloaf and weak coffee hung in the air, mixing with the sharper scent of beer and old memories. Earl Whitmore had not planned to come inside. He had planned to walk past, maybe pause at the memorial stone out front where names were carved into granite. But the smell of hot food had stopped him. 3 days since his last real meal. His Social Security check stretched thin across medications. In the room, he rented above a laundromat that smelled of detergent and mildew. The sign outside had said, "All veterans welcome." He had made the mistake of believing it. Reeves approached the corner table with 3 of his men flanking him like a pack sensing weakness. The lieutenant commander was 34 years old, handsome in the way of men who have never truly been broken, confident in a way that came from 2 combat deployments and a chest full of ribbons. He had appointed himself the gatekeeper of this gathering. Protecting the teams from frauds and stolen valor cases was his personal mission, and this hunched figure in the faded denim jacket looked exactly like the kind of charity case who wandered in claiming service he had never rendered. "You got a DD-214, Pops?" Reeves leaned against the table, close enough that Earl could smell the beer on his breath. "Or did you just see the free food sign and figure nobody would check?" Earl set down his fork. He looked up slowly, and for just a moment something flickered behind his clouded eyes. Something cold and ancient and infinitely patient. Then it was gone, replaced by the mild expression of a man who had learned long ago that dignity required no defense. "Just came for a meal, sir." Did not mean to cause any trouble. His voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from disuse, carrying the automatic respect of a man who had spent a lifetime saying sir and ma'am to everyone he met. "I can leave if you would prefer." The response seemed to irritate Reeves more than defiance would have. He wanted a reaction. He wanted the old man to puff up, to make claims, to give him a reason. Instead, he got quiet courtesy, and it made him push harder. One of Reeves's men, a petty officer named Torres, shifted uncomfortably. Something about the old man bothered him. The way he sat with his back to the wall and his eyes tracking exits. The way his hands never trembled despite his age. But Torres said nothing. Reeves was his commanding officer, and questioning him publicly was not an option. "That anchor tattoo on your forearm." Reeves gestured at the faded ink visible below Earl's rolled sleeve. "Let me guess. Got drunk in Tijuana 20 years ago and thought it looked cool? You know impersonating a service member is a federal offense, right?" Earl's hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, fingers finding the shape of something he carried there. A corroded dive knife that had not cut anything in 54 years. A weight he could not set down. If you are watching from anywhere around the world right now, let us know where you are joining us from in the comments below. Stories about quiet heroes like this one happen in every community. Maybe you have a VFW or American Legion post in your town. Maybe you have walked past a man like Earl without knowing what he carried. Drop your location below and hit subscribe so you do not miss what happens next. Because what happens next in this hall is going to change everything. Across the room, in the kitchen doorway, a one-armed man named Vernon Oates had stopped stirring a pot of gravy. He was 67 years old, a Vietnam-era SEAL who had lost his arm below the elbow during an operation that remained classified to this day. For 53 years, he had visited a star on a wall at Langley, speaking to a dead man who had saved his life. Now he stood frozen, ladle dripping, staring at the profile of the hunched figure in the corner. That profile, that voice, barely audible, but carrying a cadence Vernon would know anywhere. The way the old man held his shoulders, even when curved with age. It cannot be, because the man Vernon was thinking of had died in the South China Sea in 1971. Vernon had watched him go under. He had wept at the memorial. He had spent half a century carrying the guilt of surviving when his team leader had not. But those hands, Vernon could see them from across the room, scarred in patterns that told stories, moving with an economy of motion that did not belong to a vagrant. Reeves was still talking, his voice carrying through the hall as more people turned to watch the entertainment. His men were laughing again, phones coming out to capture what they assumed would be another stolen valor takedown to post online. So which is it, Pops? Reeves leaned closer, his voice dropping to something meaner, more personal. Merchant Marine? Coast Guard Reserve? But did you just wander in off the street, looking for a handout from men who actually served? Earl's hand paused over his plate. His fingers were still wrapped around the knife in his pocket. Marcus's knife. The last thing his swim buddy had ever touched before the blood loss took him. For just a moment, the hunched old man seemed to shift. His shoulders squared a fraction of an inch. His clouded eyes cleared, and behind them was something that made Torres take an involuntary step backward. Then it was gone. Earl resumed cutting his meatloaf into precise squares. The same size, the same spacing, the way he had cut everything for 60 years, because in his world precision was the difference between living and dying. I serve, sir. Earl's whisper carried further than it should have. That is all I will say. Vernon Oates set down his ladle. His remaining hand was trembling so badly he could not hold it steady. He began moving through the crowd toward the corner table, his heart pounding with a terrible hope he did not dare name. Because if he was right about who was sitting in that corner, then Kyle Reeves had not just insulted a homeless veteran. He had just mocked a legend. The smell of the meatloaf triggered it. Institutional food always did. The gravy too thick, the meat too processed, served on compartmentalized trays that could have been anywhere. Could have been any decade. Could have been the mess hall at Da Nang in November of 1970, the night before everything changed. Earl's hands kept cutting, but his mind was somewhere else. 54 years melted away like fog burning off the South China Sea, and he was 24 years old again. Lean as a blade, eyes that missed nothing, hands that had not yet learned to tremble. Marcus Webb sat across from him in that memory, spooning cold beans from a Croatian can and grinning like a man who did not know he had less than 36 hours to live. Marcus had the kind of face that made people trust him instantly. Square jaw, honest eyes, a smile that crinkled the corners of his mouth even when nothing was funny. He and Earl had gone through UDT training together, had earned their place in Underwater Demolition Team 21 side by side, had sworn the oath that every swim buddy swore. We go home together, or we do not go home at all. You're doing it again. Marcus's voice echoed across the decades. That thing where you disappear inside your head. Come on, Spectre. Tomorrow is going to be hell. Tonight, we eat these terrible beans, and we talk about what we're going to do when we get home. Earl had smiled then. He remembered smiling. It felt like remembering a foreign language he had once spoken fluently. I'm going to sleep for a week, Earl had said. Then I'm going to find a woman who does not know what I do and marry her before she figures it out. Marcus had laughed. That is your plan? Find someone ignorant enough to love you? Works for most marriages. They had talked through the night. About home. About futures neither of them could see clearly. About the mission briefing that had laid out the Sun Tay raid in precise detail. The extraction of American POWs from a camp 23 miles west of Hanoi. The most audacious rescue attempt of the entire war. Earl's team was not going in. They were the backup extraction positioned in the South China Sea in case everything went sideways. Everything went sideways. Earl's fingers found the dive knife in his pocket. the corroded blade that had once been sharp enough to cut through bone. Marcus had carried this knife through 2 tours. He had used it to save Earl's life in the Mekong Delta when a Vietnamese fighter got too close. He had pressed it into Earl's hands in the water off the coast, blood blooming around them like ink, his voice already fading. "Take it." The memory of Marcus's final words cut deeper than any blade. "You take it and you get the others home. That is an order, Spectre. Not your fault. Never your fault. But it had always been." Earl had been team lead. He had made the call to surface when they did. He had not seen the patrol boat until it was too late, until Marcus was throwing himself between the gunfire and the wounded ensign they were carrying. 90 seconds. That was how long it took Marcus Webb to bleed out in the warm waters of the South China Sea. Earl had held him the entire time, treading water, watching the light leave his eyes, feeling the grip on his arm weaken and then release. The others made it home. Earl had kept his promise. He had dragged them through 14 miles of enemy-patrolled waters with a perforated lung and 3 cracked ribs. He had delivered them to the extraction point, and then he had collapsed. And when he woke up in the hospital ship 3 days later, the Navy had already begun the process of declaring him dead. Easier that way, they said. Cleaner. The operation was classified beyond classification, and dead men did not give interviews or write memoirs. Earl had been given a choice. Accept a star on a wall at Langley and a new identity, or spend the rest of his career buried in paperwork and security briefings. He chose the star. He chose to let Earl Whitmore die in the South China Sea with his swim buddy. He had been a ghost ever since, drifting through decades like a man underwater, always holding his breath, always waiting for the surface that never came. Someone was speaking to him. A woman's voice, gentle but persistent, cutting through the fog of memory. "Sir, are you all right?" Earl blinked. The mess hall at Da Nang dissolved, replaced by the VFW hall with its yellowed photographs and its smell of weak coffee. A woman stood beside his table, concern evident in her eyes. She wore a Navy uniform with chaplain insignia, and she held a coffee pot like it was a peace offering. Sarah Chun had been a Navy chaplain for 20 years. She had sat with admirals in their final hours and held the hands of seamen who wept for their mothers. She had learned to read people the way some people read books, and something about this old man made her pause, made her look closer. "Thought you might like some coffee." She poured without waiting for an answer, filling the chipped mug beside his plate. "Noticed you sitting alone over here." Earl looked at her for a long moment. His clouded eyes seemed to focus, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. There was something behind those eyes, something vast and deep and profoundly broken. "Thank you, ma'am." His voice was a whisper, rough as sandpaper. "That is kind of you." Sarah pulled out the chair across from him and sat without asking permission. 20 years as a chaplain had taught her that sometimes presence mattered more than words. She watched his hands as he lifted the coffee. No tremor despite his age. The scars across his knuckles told stories she could not read. The way he held the mug, handle turned inward, fingers wrapped around it like a weapon, spoke of training so deep it had become instinct. "Been coming to these gatherings long?" Sarah kept her voice casual. First time, Earl took a sip of the coffee. A small kindness burned like fire in his chest. He could not remember the last time someone had simply sat with him. Saw the sign. All veterans welcome. Sarah heard what he did not say. That he had been hungry. That he had not expected to be welcome. That men like Kyle Reeves made sure certain veterans knew their place. She glanced across the room to where Reeves was holding court with his team, laughing about something, occasionally shooting looks toward the corner table. She had seen the confrontation. She had wanted to intervene, but had been caught in conversation with a Gold Star mother who needed her presence more. "Do not mind them." Sarah turned back to Earl. Some men never learn that the uniform does not make the soldier. Earl's hand drifted to his pocket again, to the knife, to Marcus. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "It is not." Sarah watched him trace the outline of whatever he carried in that pocket. She watched the way his eyes went distant, seeing something beyond the walls of this hall. She watched the way his shoulders curled inward, not with weakness, but with the weight of something he had been carrying for longer than she had been alive. She did not know who this man was. She did not know what he had done or what had been done to him. But she knew, with the certainty that came from 2 decades of ministry, that she was sitting across from someone who had earned a right to be here more than anyone else in this room. And she knew, with equal certainty, that before this night was over, everyone else would know it too. Reeves was not finished. Men like Reeves were never finished until they had drawn blood or been put down, and Earl Whitmore looked like easy prey. The lieutenant commander excused himself from his circle of admirers and made his way back toward the corner table, his stride carrying the confidence of a man who had never been truly humiliated. Saracen saw him coming. She straightened in her chair, prepared to intervene, but Earl placed a weathered hand on the table between them. A small gesture, a quiet request. Let it play out. She did not understand why, but she honored it. Well. Reeves planted himself at the end of the table, arms crossed over his chest. Made a friend, did you? He nodded at Sarah with mock courtesy. Chaplain, doing your good deed for the day. Just having coffee with a fellow veteran, Commander. Sarah kept her voice level. As the sign outside suggests we do. Reeves snorted. Veteran, right? He turned his attention back to Earl, and his voice rose enough to carry across the hall. Here's what I think, old-timer. I think you saw an opportunity. Free food, warm building, bunch of people too polite to call you out. I have seen 100 guys like you. Buy a jacket from Goodwill with some patches on it. Memorize a few war stories from the internet. And suddenly you are a hero. Earl said nothing. His hands remained still on the table, flanking the plate he had stopped eating from. His breathing was slow and measured, the rhythm of a man who had learned to control every function of his body in situations far more stressful than this. 3 of Reeves's men had followed him over. Torres hung back, still bothered by something he could not name. The other 2, Petty Officers Hendricks and Walsh, positioned themselves like they were preparing for a confrontation. Witnesses throughout the hall had turned to watch. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked entertained. A few had their phones out, recording. You know what really burns me? Reeves leaned forward, palms on the table, putting his face close to Earl's. It is not the free meal. Take the food, I do not care. It is the disrespect. It is sitting in a hall full of men who actually bled for this country, wearing that anchor tattoo like you earned it. It is the insult to everyone who actually served. I served. Earl's whisper was so quiet that only those closest heard it. Reeves laughed. The sound was sharp and theatrical, meant for the audience as much as for Earl. You served, right? Where? When? What unit? Because I have got 20 years of training in spotting operators, and you know what I see when I look at you? I see a guy who maybe pushed papers at some stateside base for a couple years, if that. I see a guy who has been dining out on that anchor tattoo for decades. Earl's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His hand drifted toward his pocket, toward Marcus's knife, then stopped. He would not reach for it, would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him need the comfort. I'm going to ask you one more time. Reeves straightened, his voice taking on the tone of an ultimatum. Show me a DD-214. Show me anything that proves you served. Or admit you are a fraud and walk out of here before I call the shore patrol and have you removed. The hall had gone quiet. Conversation stopped. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Every eye was on the corner table where a decorated SEAL officer was demanding proof from a hunched old man in a faded denim jacket. In the kitchen doorway, Vernon Oates had gone completely still. His remaining hand gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles had turned white. He was close enough now to see details he had missed from across the room. The precise way the old man held himself even while hunched. The scars on his hands that told stories written in combat. The faded anchor on his forearm that was not just any anchor. It was a fouled anchor, the symbol of a Navy chief petty officer. And beneath it, barely visible through decades of sun damage and age spots, Vernon could see the outline of something else. Numbers. Coordinates. The kind of tattoo that men got to remember things they were never allowed to speak about. Vernon's heart was hammering against his ribs. His missing arm ached with phantom pain, the way it always did when memories of Vietnam clawed their way to the surface. He had been 22 years old when he lost that arm. He had been bleeding out in a jungle clearing when a man had appeared out of nowhere, thrown Vernon over his shoulder, and carried him 3 miles through enemy territory to extraction. That man had been declared dead 6 months later. Vernon had mourned him for 53 years. Earl. Vernon's lips formed the name, but no sound came out. Earl Whitmore. Back at the corner table, Reeves was growing impatient with the silence. That is what I thought. He grabbed the edge of Earl's chair, preparing to pull it back, to physically remove this vagrant from the gathering. Torres stepped forward, hand raised to stop his commanding officer, but he was too slow. Reeves's hand closed around Earl's forearm to haul him up, and Earl's sleeve rode back. The tattoo was fully visible now, not just the fouled anchor. Below it, coordinates in faded blue ink. 21.0278 degrees north. 105.8342 degrees east. A date, November 23rd, 1970. And below that, the number 21. Torres made a sound like he had been punched in the gut. His face went pale. His hand, still raised, began to tremble. Sir, his voice cracked. Lieutenant Commander, you need to stop. You need to look at this. Reeves paused, irritated at the interruption. What? Torres pointed at Earl's exposed forearm with a shaking finger. Those coordinates, sir. I know those coordinates. Everyone who went through BUD/S in the last 20 years knows those coordinates. Reeves looked down. For the first time, his confidence flickered. Vernon Oates pushed through the last of the crowd and stopped 3 feet from the table. His face was the color of ash. Tears were already forming in his eyes, tears he did not bother to hide. Kyle! Vernon's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Step away from him. Now! Reeves turned, annoyance flashing across his features. Who the hell do you think you are? Telling me what to do. You are a cook. You are retired. You do not give me orders. Vernon did not look at Reeves. His eyes were locked on Earl's face, searching for something, finding it, breaking apart at the discovery. Earl finally looked up. His clouded eyes met Vernon's, and something passed between them. Recognition, not from Vernon to Earl, from Earl recognizing Vernon, the young petty officer who lost his arm in a jungle clearing in 1971. The kid Earl had carried 3 miles through hell. You made it. Earl's whisper was barely audible. You made it home. Vernon's knees buckled. He caught himself on the table, his one hand splayed across the surface, his whole body shaking. Earl? His voice broke on the name. Earl Whitmore? But that is impossible. That is impossible because Earl Whitmore died in the South China Sea in 1971. I watched him go under. I have visited his star on the wall at Langley every year for 53 years. The room had stopped breathing. Every person in that hall was frozen, watching something they did not yet understand unfold. Earl looked at Vernon for a long moment. Then his weathered face cracked into the ghost of a smile. The reports of my death, he said quietly, were greatly exaggerated. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Reeves stood frozen, his hands still gripping Earl's arm, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. Vernon Oates was weeping openly now, tears cutting tracks down his weathered face, his one hand reaching toward Earl like a man reaching for a mirage he expected to vanish. Earl Whitmore. Vernon said the name again, tasting it, testing its reality. Spectre. The call sign rippled through the room. Torres inhaled sharply. Hendricks and Walsh exchanged glances of dawning horror. Even those who did not recognize the name could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden weight of something historic pressing down on the gathering. Earl gently removed his arm from Reeves's slackened grip. He rose slowly from his chair, and as he did, something changed. The hunch in his shoulders lessened. His spine straightened by degrees. The clouded film over his eyes seemed to clear, and beneath it was something ancient and fierce and unutterably sad. Sit down, Vernon. Earl's voice was still quiet, but it carried a command presence that made Reeves take an involuntary step backward. Before you fall down. Vernon did not sit. He could not. His legs had locked in place, and his body was shaking with the effort of remaining upright. 53 years. His voice cracked on every syllable. I have talked to you every week for 53 years. At the wall. At your star. I told you about my kids. My grandkids. I told you when Maria died. I told you everything, Earl. Everything. And you were alive this whole time? Earl closed his eyes. The pain that crossed his face was so raw, so exposed, that Sarah Chun had to look away. I know, Earl whispered. I know, Vernon. And I am sorry. I am so sorry. The room remained frozen. Reeves had retreated several steps, his confidence shattered, his face cycling through confusion and disbelief and the dawning realization that he had made a catastrophic error. Torres had tears streaming down his cheeks, though he could not have explained why. He only knew that he was witnessing something sacred, something that would mark him for the rest of his life. Earl opened his eyes and looked at Vernon. Really looked at him, taking in the silver hair and the lined face and the empty sleeve pinned neatly at the elbow. You were 22 years old. Earl's voice was distant, traveling back through decades. April 1971. Operation Thunderhead. We were supposed to intercept a POW transport moving through the jungle. Intel was wrong. There were 3 times as many guards as we expected. Vernon nodded, tears still falling. His remaining hand had found Earl's arm, gripping it like an anchor. You took a burst across the chest. Earl continued, each word pulled from somewhere deep and locked away. The rounds went through your bicep and shattered the bone. You were bleeding out. The extraction point was 3 miles through enemy territory, and you could not walk. You carried me. Vernon's voice was barely audible. I remember. I was fading in and out, but I remember. You threw me over your shoulder, and you ran. 3 miles through the jungle with a man on your back. Earl's hand came up to rest on Vernon's shoulder. The touch was gentle, almost tentative, like he had forgotten how to offer comfort. You kept trying to tell me to leave you. Earl's ghost of a smile returned. You kept saying you were slowing me down. Order me to go. Vernon laughed through his tears. You told me to shut up and save my strength. I did. You said you would carry me to hell and back if you had to. I meant it. Vernon's composure finally broke completely. He pulled Earl into an embrace, his one arm wrapped around the older man with desperate strength. Earl stiffened for a moment, unaccustomed to touch, to warmth, to the simple human contact he had denied himself for so long. Then slowly, gradually, his arms came up to return the embrace. The room watched in silence. Phones had been lowered. No one was recording anymore. This moment was too sacred for social media, too raw for the casual consumption of strangers. Sarah Chun wiped tears from her own eyes. She had been a chaplain for 20 years. She had witnessed reunions and reconciliations, had been present for moments of grace that defied explanation. But she had never seen anything like this. 2 old warriors holding each other in a VFW hall. One mourning a death that never happened, the other mourning a life he had been afraid to live. When they finally separated, Vernon kept his hand on Earl's arm, as if afraid he might disappear again. Why? Vernon's voice was hoarse. Why did you let us think you were dead? Why did you never come back? Earl was silent for a long moment. His eyes had gone distant again, seeing something beyond the walls of this hall, beyond the decades that separated this moment from the one that had broken him. November 23rd, 1970. Earl's voice dropped to barely a whisper. The South China Sea. We were extracting assets from a blown operation. Marcus Webb was point man. Vernon's face crumpled. He remembered Marcus. Everyone who had served in UDD-21 remembered Marcus Webb. Patrol boat came out of nowhere. Earl continued, each word costing him something. Marcus saw it before I did. He put himself between the gunfire and Ensign Patterson. Took 4 rounds to the chest. Earl's hand went to his pocket, pulling out the corroded dive knife. He held it between them, the blade pitted and dark with age. He bled out of my arms. 90 seconds. I counted every one of them. His last words were in order. Get the others home. Not your fault. Never your fault. Vernon stared at the knife. He recognized it. Every man in UDD-21 had known Marcus Webb's dive knife. I got them home. Earl's voice had gone flat, mechanical, reciting facts stripped of emotion because the emotion would destroy him. Patterson, Reyes, Mitchell, 14 miles through enemy waters. When I woke up on the hospital ship, the Navy was already processing my death certificate. Easier to let Spectre die than explain how the operation went wrong. So you just disappeared? Vernon asked. Earl met his eyes. Marcus died because of my call. I gave the orders surface. I missed a patrol boat. He died 90 seconds later in my arms, and his last words were telling me it was not my fault. Earl's voice finally cracked. But it was always my fault, and I could not carry that weight and be Spectre. I could not be the legend when I had gotten my brother killed. So I let them bury the name. I let them put a star on a wall, and I have been a ghost ever since. Vernon pulled him close again. His voice was fierce against Earl's ear. It was not your fault. Marcus made his choice. He saved Patterson because that is who he was. You honored him by saving the others. You honored him every day you survived. Earl said nothing, but his shoulders shook, and for the first time in 54 years, he allowed himself to weep for Marcus Webb. The moment stretched and held, two old men grieving together in a room full of strangers who were beginning to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. When Earl finally pulled back from Vernon's embrace, his eyes were red but clear. The tears had washed something away, some barrier he had built over 5 decades of solitude. Reese had not moved. He stood rooted to the spot, his face drained of color, his earlier confidence evaporated like morning fog. His men had retreated several paces, forming a loose semicircle of uncertainty. Torres was openly weeping, making no effort to hide it. Hendricks and Walsh exchanged glances that carried the weight of dawning comprehension. The hall had transformed. What had been a casual Memorial Day gathering was now something else entirely. People had risen from their seats, drawn toward the corner table by an instinct older than language. Gold Star mothers clutched tissues to their faces. Retired operators with silver beards and knowing eyes had gone still, reading the situation with the fluency of men who had lived through moments like this. Sarah Chun remained in her chair, hands folded in her lap, bearing witness. She understood now why she had felt compelled to sit with this man, why something in her spirit had recognized something in his. She was watching resurrection. She was watching a dead man choose to live again. Vernon kept his hand on Earl's arm, still afraid to let go. His voice was steadier now, but barely. All these years, Vernon shook his head slowly. All these years, I thought you were gone. I named my son after you, Earl. My firstborn. I told him stories about the man who saved my life. I told him Spectre was the bravest man I ever knew. Earl's throat worked. He could not speak. He is here tonight. Vernon turned, scanning the crowd. Marcus Earl Oates. Name for you and for Webb. Where is he? Where's my boy? A man in his late 40s pushed through the gathering. He had Vernon's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he wore the insignia of a Navy captain on his dress uniform. He had been standing near the back of the hall when the confrontation began, had watched it unfold with growing disbelief. Dad? Captain Marcus Oates reached his father's side, his eyes moving between Vernon and the hunched stranger. What is going on? Who is this? Vernon's face split into a smile that was equal parts joy and grief. This is him. This is the man you were named for. This is Earl Whitmore. Spectre. Captain Oates went rigid. His training kept him upright, but only barely. He had grown up on stories of Spectre. He had chosen his career because of those stories. He had written his thesis at the Naval War College on unconventional operations in Vietnam, and Spectre's missions had featured prominently in his research. That is impossible. His voice came out strangled. Spectre died in 1971. There is a star at Langley. Earl looked at the younger man, at Vernon's son, at the living proof that some part of his legacy had survived even when he had tried to erase himself from history. Stars do not always mark graves. Earl's whisper carried through the silent hall. Sometimes they mark men who got lost on the way home. Captain Oates stared at him for a long moment. Then he did something that made every active duty SEAL in the room snap to attention. He came to parade rest, chin high, shoulders squared. Master Chief Whitmore. His voice rang out clear and formal. If you are who my father says you are, then I have waited my entire life to meet you. I have questions, sir. Questions only one man could answer. Earl's spine straightened another degree. The military bearing he had suppressed for decades was reasserting itself, called forth by the formality in this young captain's voice. Ask. Captain Oates did not hesitate. Operation Kingfisher. August 1969. The extraction of a CIA asset from the Mekong Delta. Official records say a foreman team went in. Unofficial accounts suggest there was a fifth. A swimmer who went alone through 2 miles of enemy-controlled waterway to disable patrol boats before the extraction could proceed. Records never identified him, but the asset, when debriefed, said the swimmer introduced himself with a single word. Earl closed his eyes. Spectre. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. Ripples spread through the crowd. Men who had served, who knew what that kind of mission entailed, exchanged looks of awe. My God. Torres's voice was barely audible. It is really him. Reeves made a sound. It might have been a word, might have been just air escaping his lungs. His face had gone from pale to gray. His hands hung limp at his sides. Captain Oates was not finished. Santé. November 1970. The raid went wrong. Extraction team took casualties. Official report says all surviving team members were recovered by standard naval assets. But there is a classified addendum, sir. Sealed until 2020. I read it as part of my War College research. Earl opened his eyes. The addendum describes a single operator who swam 14 miles through hostile waters with 3 wounded men, 2 of whom could not swim on their own. It describes a man who sustained a perforated lung and multiple rib fractures during the initial engagement, but refused medical evacuation until all surviving team members were aboard the hospital ship. It describes a man who flatlined twice on the operating table and was pronounced dead before spontaneous resurrection. The room had stopped breathing. The addendum says that man's name was classified at the highest level, that he was given a star at Langley and officially listed as killed in action to protect ongoing operations. Captain Oates's voice dropped. That man's call sign was Spectre. Earl said nothing. His silence was confirmation enough. Vernon's grip on his arm tightened. 14 miles. His voice shook. With a perforated lung, carrying wounded men. And you never told anyone. You never took credit. You just disappeared. Earl finally spoke. His voice was rough, scraped raw by decades of disuse and a lifetime of grief. The men who needed to know knew. The men who survived, survived. That was all that mattered. Sarah Chun rose from her chair. She moved to stand beside Earl, her presence a quiet offer of support. She did not touch him. She simply stood close enough that he could feel he was not alone. Master Chief Whitmore. Her voice was gentle but carried. On behalf of the Navy Chaplain Corps, and on behalf of everyone in this room, I want to say something that should have been said 54 years ago. Earl turned to look at her. Welcome home. The words broke something open. In Earl, in Vernon, in every person who had served and sacrificed and carried weights that civilians could never understand. Welcome home. 2 words that meant everything to men who had wandered in the wilderness of their own guilt. Earl's eyes glistened. His jaw worked. And then, for the first time in 54 years, he answered. Thank you. It is good to finally be here. The silence that followed Sarah Chen's words was not empty. It was full, pregnant with decades of unspoken gratitude and grief finally given voice. Earl stood at the center of it. A man who had spent 54 years trying to disappear, now finding himself seen by everyone in the room. Reeves had not moved. He stood like a statue carved from shame, his face a mask of dawning horror as the magnitude of his error crystallized. He had mocked a legend. He had demanded proof of service from a man whose service was literally classified. He had tried to throw out the very archetype of what it meant to be a Navy SEAL. Torres approached slowly, his movements hesitant, reverent. He stopped 3 feet from Earl and came to attention with a precision that would have satisfied any drill instructor. Master Chief Whitmore. Torres's voice trembled. Sir, I wrote my thesis at Naval Postgraduate School on unconventional warfare operations in Vietnam. Your missions were case studies. We studied Kingfisher. We studied the Mekong extractions. We studied everything we could find which was not much because most of it is still classified. Earl regarded the young petty officer with something approaching warmth. The boy reminded him of Marcus. That same earnest intensity, that same hunger to understand. We used to debate what happened to Spectre. Torres continued, the words tumbling out. Some guys thought you died in action. Others thought you went black, deep cover, never came back. Nobody thought you were just out here, living, surviving. Earl's hand found Marcus's knife in his pocket. The weight of it grounded him. Surviving is not the same as living, son. His whisper carried. I stopped living a long time ago. I have just been marking time ever since. Vernon made a sound of protest, but Earl raised a hand. It is the truth, Vernon. I am not proud of it, but it is true. After Marcus died, after they put that star on the wall, I did not know how to be anyone else. Spectre was dead. Earl Whitmore was a ghost. And ghosts do not get to have lives. They just haunt the edges of other people's stories. Sarah Chan spoke softly. But you are here now. You walked into this hall tonight. Earl turned to look at her. His clouded eyes held something fragile, something he had not allowed himself to feel in decades. I was hungry. His honesty was brutal in its simplicity. I saw the sign. All veterans welcome. I thought maybe I could eat a meal without anyone noticing me. I did not expect this. He gestured vaguely at the gathering, at the faces watching him with awe and grief and recognition. I did not want this. Captain Oates stepped forward. His father's hand still rested on Earl's arm, tethering the old man to the present. With respect, Master Chief, maybe what you wanted stopped matching the moment you walked through that door. Captain Oates's voice was firm but kind. You spent 54 years honoring Marcus Webb by disappearing. Maybe it is time to honor him differently. Earl's jaw tightened. How? By living. By letting people know what he died for. By letting the men who came after you understand what the Brotherhood really means. The words landed like depth charges, exploding somewhere deep in Earl's chest. He had never thought of it that way. He had always seen his survival as a betrayal, his continued existence as an insult to Marcus's sacrifice. The idea that he could honor Marcus by living rather than by slowly dying had never occurred to him. Vernon squeezed his arm. He would have hated this, Earl. Marcus would have hated knowing you spent 50 years punishing yourself for his choice. He made that call. He put himself between the bullets and Patterson. That was who he was. Earl's voice cracked. I was team lead. It was my job to see the threat. My job to protect my men. I failed. You got 3 men home through 14 miles of enemy water with a hole in your lung. Vernon's voice rose, fierce and unwavering. You flatlined twice and came back because the mission was not complete. You did everything Marcus would have wanted you to do. Everything except forgive yourself. Earl closed his eyes. The weight of 54 years pressed down on him, but for the first time, it felt like something he might be able to set down. Not today. Maybe not tomorrow, but someday. When he opened his eyes, they were clear. Clearer than they had been in years. Across the room, movement caught his attention. Reeves was walking toward him. The lieutenant commander's face was ashen, his earlier arrogance stripped away to reveal something raw and young and terrified beneath. His men parted to let him pass, none of them meeting his eyes. Reeves stopped in front of Earl. For a long moment, he simply stood there, struggling with words that would not come. Then, slowly, painfully, he lowered himself to one knee. The hall went utterly silent. Master Chief Whitmore. Reeves's voice was hoarse, barely recognizable as the confident bark that had mocked Earl minutes ago. I do not have words for what I did. I do not have an excuse. I saw what I expected to see, and I was wrong. I was so wrong. Earl looked down at the kneeling officer. He saw a young man who had built his identity around being a guardian of the teams, who had appointed himself protector of a legacy he did not fully understand. He saw arrogance, yes, but beneath it he saw something else, something salvageable. Stand up, son. Reeves did not move. I need you to know that I am sorry, that I will carry this shame for the rest of my career, that I will never forget what I did tonight. Earl reached down and gripped Reeves's shoulder. The touch was firm, but not unkind. I said stand up. Reeves rose slowly, his eyes wet, his composure shattered. Earl held his gaze. You were protecting the Brotherhood. That instinct is not wrong. The execution was flawed, but the impulse was right. You looked at me and saw a threat to something you love. I understand that. Reeves shook his head. I should have looked closer. I should have asked instead of accused. Yes. Earl's voice carried no judgment, only truth. You should have. Remember that. Every veteran you see on these streets, every man or woman who looks broken, remember they might have carried weights you will never understand. Do not judge by appearance. Do not assume. Ask. Listen. And if you were wrong, have the courage to admit it. Reeves swallowed hard. His hand came up in a salute that trembled visibly. I will, Master Chief. I swear to God, I will never forget. Earl returned the salute. The gesture was automatic, muscle memory from a lifetime ago, but it felt different this time. It felt like something being reclaimed rather than something being buried. Good. Earl lowered his hand. Now help me find a chair. I am 78 years old. I have been standing for 20 minutes, and my knees are not what they used to be. The tension broke. Laughter rippled through the hall, the relieved laughter of people who had been holding their breath without realizing it. Reeves scrambled to pull out a chair, and Earl lowered himself into it with a grunt that was half pain and half satisfaction. Sarah Chun sat down beside him. Vernon claimed the chair on his other side, his one hand still resting on Earl's arm. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers who were rapidly becoming something else, Earl Whitmore felt something he had not felt in 54 years. He felt like he might actually belong somewhere. The hall had transformed around Earl in ways he could not have anticipated. What had been hostile territory 30 minutes ago was now something else entirely. People approached in ones and twos, respectful, tentative, as if approaching a monument that had suddenly come to life. They did not ask for stories or demand proof. They simply wanted to be near him, to shake his hand, to thank him for things they could not name. Earl accepted each greeting with the same quiet grace. His handshakes were firm despite his age, his eye contact steady, his murmured responses barely audible, but somehow enough. Vernon remained at his side like a guardian, his one arm ready to steady Earl if needed, his presence a bridge between the ghost Earl had been and the man he was becoming. Sarah Chun had stepped back to give others access, but she remained close, watching. She had called her commanding officer from the hallway, speaking in hushed tones about what was unfolding. The Navy would want to know. The right people would need to be contacted. A man who had been dead for 54 years had just returned to life in a VFW hall in Virginia, and that kind of resurrection did not happen quietly. Captain Oates was on his phone as well, pacing near the kitchen entrance. Earl caught fragments of the conversation. Admiral Patterson. Verification request. Langley coordination. The machinery of military bureaucracy was spinning up, preparing to process a miracle. Earl did not care about any of it. He was watching something else. Across the room, a young woman had entered through the main doors. She wore civilian clothes, but carried herself with military bearing. Her hair was dark, her eyes sharp, and she moved through the crowd with purpose until she reached Torres. They spoke briefly, heads close together, and then both turned to look at Earl. The woman approached. She stopped in front of Earl's chair and studied him with an intensity that reminded him of intelligence officers he had known in another life. Master Chief Whitmore. Her voice was crisp, professional. My name is Lieutenant Commander Diana Webb. I serve with Naval Special Warfare Development Group. Earl's heart stopped. Webb. My grandfather was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. The woman's voice softened slightly. He died in 1970 during a classified operation in the South China Sea. My father never knew him. He was born 3 months after my grandfather's death. Earl could not breathe. The room had narrowed to a pinpoint, containing only himself and this woman who carried Marcus's name, Marcus's blood, Marcus's legacy. I grew up on stories. Diana continued, her composure cracking slightly at the edges. My grandmother told my father everything she knew, which was not much. Just that Marcus died saving other men. That he was a hero. That somewhere out there, the men he saved were still living because of what he did. Earl's hand went to his pocket. His fingers closed around the corroded knife. She told my father about Spectre. Diana's voice dropped. About the team leader who carried the survivors home. About the man who vanished after the mission and was declared dead. My father spent years trying to find out what happened to you. He wanted to thank you for bringing his father's body home. Earl shook his head slowly. I did not bring him home. He died in my arms in the water. We could not recover him. The patrol boats were too close. I had to leave him. The words tore out of him like shrapnel. The deepest wound. The one that had never healed. He had saved the living, but he had left Marcus floating in the South China Sea, drifting in the dark, alone. Diana Webb knelt in front of him. Her military bearing dissolved, and suddenly she was just a woman looking at an old man who had carried her grandfather's memory for longer than she had been alive. My grandmother knew. Her voice was gentle. The Navy told her everything, eventually. She knew you had to leave him. She knew you had no choice. And she spent the rest of her life praying for you. Earl's vision blurred. Praying for me? She said you would carry guilt that was not yours to carry. She said the weight of leaving Marcus would crush you if you let it. She prayed that someday you would find peace, that you would forgive yourself. Diana reached out and placed her hand over Earl's, over the pocket that held a knife. She died 4 years ago, Master Chief. But before she went, she made me promise something. Earl cannot speak. His throat had closed completely. She made me promise that if I ever found you, if somehow you were still alive out there, I would tell you something. Diana's eyes were bright with tears. She would tell you that Marcus loved you like a brother, that he made his choice freely and without regret, and that the only thing that would ever dishonor his sacrifice was if you spent your life in chains he never meant to put on you. The knife in Earl's pocket seemed to pulse with heat. 54 years. 54 years of carrying that blade, that guilt, that impossible weight. And now Marcus's granddaughter was kneeling before him, delivering a message from beyond the grave. She forgave you, Master Chief. Diana's voice cracked. She forgave you decades ago. The only one who never forgave you is you. Earl pulled the knife from his pocket. His hands trembled as he held it out, the corroded blade catching the light. This was his. The words came out broken. I have carried it since that night. I cannot let it go. I cannot let him go. Diana looked at the knife. Her grandfather's knife. The last thing he had ever touched before the blood loss took him. She did not reach for it. He gave it to you for a reason. She closed Earl's fingers back around the handle. He wanted you to survive. He wanted you to live. Not just exist. Live. Earl stared at the knife in his hands. At Diana kneeling before him. At Vernon, standing beside him with tears streaming down his weathered face. At the room full of strangers who had become witnesses to his resurrection. I do not know how. Earl's whisper was barely audible. I do not know how to live anymore. Diana rose to her feet. She extended her hand to him. Then let us teach you. Earl looked at her hand, at the offer it represented, at the terrifying possibility of stepping out of the shadows after 54 years of hiding. He thought of Marcus, of the last words his brother had spoken. Get the others home. Not your fault. Never your fault. He thought of Marcus's wife, spending decades praying for a man she had never met. He thought of the boy who had been born 3 months after his father's death, who had grown up and raised a daughter who now wore the uniform and carried on the Webb family tradition of service. Marcus's legacy, not ended in the South China Sea, continued, extended, alive in this woman standing before him. Earl reached out and took Diana's hand. Okay. His voice was rough but steady. Teach me. Diana Webb helped Earl to his feet. The old man rose slowly, joints protesting decades of neglect and hard living. But there was something different in the way he held himself now. The hunch had lessened. His shoulders had squared. The ghost was becoming flesh again, one moment at a time. The hall had grown crowded. Word had spread beyond the VFW walls, carried by phone calls and text messages and the invisible networks that connected the special operations community. Men were arriving in ones and twos, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes that could not quite hide the bearing of warriors. They came through the doors and stopped, scanning the room until their eyes found Earl, and then they simply stood and watched. Vernon leaned close to Earl's ear. They are coming to see you. The old operators. The ones who remember. Earl shook his head slowly. They remember a legend. A story. I'm just an old man who got lost. You're both. Diana had not released his hand. You are the legend and the man. That is what makes you real. Captain Oates approached, his phone still in his hand. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and awe. Master Chief, I just got off the phone with Admiral Patterson, commander of Naval Special Warfare. He is on his way here personally. Earl blinked. What? Admiral Patterson. Captain Oates repeated. He read your file when he was a lieutenant. He has been teaching Spectre operations at the War College for 15 years. When I told him you were alive, he went silent for 30 seconds. Then he said he was getting in his car. Earl did not know how to respond. The machinery of his resurrection was moving faster than he could process. 54 years of invisibility, and now an admiral was driving through the night to meet him. Sarah Chun appeared at his elbow. The Navy is contacting Langley. There are going to be questions, Master Chief. A lot of questions. Your star on the wall, your classified status, your benefits, your identity. It is going to take time to sort out. Earl almost laughed. Benefits. He had been living on Social Security payments mailed to a name that was not quite his own, sleeping in a room above a laundromat, eating every third day when money was tight. The idea of benefits seemed absurd. I do not need benefits. Earl's voice was quiet. I just need to understand what happens now. Now you let people help you. Vernon's grip on his arm tightened. Now you stop running. Now you let us bring you home the way you brought all those men home 50 years ago. The words hit Earl like a physical blow. Bring you home. That was what he had done. That was all he had ever done. Brought men home from places they should not have survived. Carried them through jungles and oceans and nightmares. And then, when it was his turn to be carried, he had walked away instead. Torres pushed through the crowd, his young face flushed with excitement. Master Chief, there are reporters outside. Someone posted something on social media. They want a statement. Earl's stomach dropped. No reporters. No cameras. I'm not a story. Diana stepped in front of him, blocking his view of the door. You do not have to talk to anyone you do not want to talk to. We will handle it. She turned and nodded at Reeves, who was hovering nearby with the desperate energy of a man seeking redemption through action. Reeves straightened immediately. Lieutenant Commander Reeves. Diana's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. Secure that entrance. No media inside. Anyone who is not a veteran or active duty does not get through those doors. Reeves snapped into motion, grateful for a mission, for something concrete he could do to begin making amends. He gathered his men with sharp gestures and moved toward the main entrance. Earl watched him go. The young officer's earlier arrogance had been replaced by something harder and more valuable. Humility. The kind that only came from being absolutely wrong and knowing it. He's a good man. Earl said it quietly, almost to himself. He just needed to be broken a little. Vernon snorted. You broke him plenty. He will be telling this story for the rest of his career. The night he tried to throw Spectre out of a VFW hall. The night he learned to look closer. Earl corrected. That is the story he should tell. Not the mistake. The lesson. The crowd parted near the kitchen entrance, and a new figure emerged. He was old, older even than Earl, with a face like cracked leather and eyes that had seen things most men could not imagine. He walked with a cane, but moved with the deliberate precision of a man who had once moved through jungles without making a sound. He stopped 10 feet from Earl and simply stared. Vernon's breath caught. Oh my God, that is Master Chief Bosun Henry Callahan. He was UDT before any of us. Cordell, early Vietnam. He trained the men who trained us. Earl recognized him, not from a weathered face, but from the way he stood, from his set of his shoulders, from a faded trident tattooed on his forearm, the ink so old it had turned blue-green with age. Callahan. Earl's whisper was barely audible. The ancient warrior's face cracked into something that might have been a smile. Spectre. His voice was like gravel rolling downhill. I told them you were not dead. Told them for 50 years. No body, no death. That was what I said. Stubborn bastards would not listen. He closed the distance between them with slow, measured steps. When he reached Earl, he did not salute. He did not shake hands. He simply reached out and gripped Earl's shoulder with a hand that still carried the strength of decades of training. "Welcome back, son." Callahan's eyes were bright. "Took you long enough." Earl felt something crack inside his chest. The last wall. The final barrier he had built between himself and the world. This man had trained his trainers. This man was a living link to the very beginning of everything Earl had become. And he was standing here in this VFW hall, welcoming Earl home. "I got lost." Earl's voice broke on the words. "I got lost, and I could not find my way back." Callahan nodded slowly. "We all get lost. Some of us in jungles. Some of us in deserts. Some of us in our own heads. The trick is not avoiding it. The trick is letting someone find you when you cannot find yourself." He turned to face the gathered crowd. His voice rose, carrying the command presence of a man who had led warriors into hell and back. This man saved more lives than any of you will ever know. He carried wounded men through enemy territory when he should have died. He completed missions that kept this country safe when no one else could. And then he spent 54 years punishing himself for the sin of surviving. Callahan's grip on Earl's shoulder tightened. "That ends tonight. Spectre is home, and anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me." The hall erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper, a sound of affirmation that rose from dozens of throats. Men coming to attention, hands rising in salute, voices calling out acknowledgement in the language of warriors. Earl stood at the center of it, Marcus's knife in his pocket, Vernon's hand on his arm, Diana Webb at his side, and Henry Callahan's grip on his shoulder. For the first time in 54 years, he was not alone. And for the first time in 54 years, he did not want to be. The doors of the VFW hall opened again, and the crowd parted like water before a ship's prow. Admiral James Patterson walked through the gap with the measured stride of a man who had commanded warriors for 3 decades. He wore civilian clothes, khakis, and a polo shirt hastily thrown on, but nothing could disguise the authority he carried. 2 aides flanked him, struggling to keep pace. The admiral stopped in the center of the hall and scanned the room until his eyes found Earl. For a long moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. Patterson was 62 years old, his hair silver, his face lined with the weight of decisions that had sent men to their deaths and brought others home. He had read Earl's file when he was a young lieutenant, had studied the operations, had taught the lessons. And now the ghost from those files was standing in front of him, flesh and blood and impossible. "Master Chief Earl Whitmore." Patterson's voice carried through the silent hall. "Call sign Spectre." Earl came to attention. The movement was automatic, muscle memory from a lifetime ago, his spine straightening, his chin lifting, his shoulders squaring. For a moment, the hunched old man in the faded denim jacket disappeared completely, replaced by the warrior who had earned that call sign in blood. "Sir." Earl's voice was stronger than it had been all night. Quiet but clear. Patterson approached slowly. His eyes moved over Earl's face, cataloging the years, searching for the young operator in the photographs he had studied so many times. "I have a photograph of you in my office." Patterson stopped 3 feet away. "Taken in 1969 after Operation Kingfisher. You're standing on the deck of a patrol boat with your team. You look like you could take on the entire North Vietnamese army single-handed." Earl remembered that photograph, remembered the arrogance of youth, the certainty that he was invincible. That certainty had died in the South China Sea with Marcus Webb. "I was a different man then, sir." Patterson nodded slowly. "We all were." He paused, his jaw tightening. "I need you to know something, Master Chief. When I took command of Naval Special Warfare, one of the first things I did was review the classified files from Vietnam. Your file was one of them." Earl said nothing. He waited. "I read about Sun Tay, about the extraction that went wrong, about what you did afterward. 14 miles through hostile waters with 3 wounded men and a perforated lung." Patterson's voice dropped. "I read about Marcus Webb, about how he died, about why you were declared dead." The name hung in the air between them. Marcus. Always Marcus. The wound that would never fully heal. "I also read the psychiatric evaluation they conducted when you woke up on the hospital ship." Patterson continued. "You told the doctors you wanted to die, that you should have died. That surviving when Marcus did not was a betrayal of everything you believed in. Earl's composure cracked. His eyes dropped to the floor. Vernon's hand tightened on his arm, holding him steady. The Navy made a decision. Patterson's voice hardened. They decided it was easier to let you die on paper than to help you live in reality. They took a broken man and threw him away. They let a hero disappear because processing his survival was too complicated. Admiral, Earl's whisper was rough. They gave me a choice. I chose to disappear. You chose what they offered you. Patterson stepped closer, a wounded man drowning in guilt, and they offered him an exit instead of a lifeline. That was not a choice. That was abandonment disguised as mercy. The words landed like hammer blows. Earl had never thought of it that way. He had always believed he had chosen his fate, that his decades of wandering were his own responsibility. But Patterson was right. They had given a drowning man a stone instead of a rope. I cannot undo 54 years. Patterson's voice softened. I cannot give you back the life you lost. But I can do something tonight that should have been done a long time ago. He turned to his aides. One of them stepped forward carrying a wooden case. Patterson took it and opened the lid. Inside, resting on velvet, was a medal, the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration for valor in naval combat. This was awarded to you in 1971. Patterson lifted the medal from its case. It has been sitting in a vault at Langley for 54 years, waiting for a dead man who is not dead. Waiting for you. Earl stared at the medal. The Navy Cross. He had not known. They had never told him. He had been too broken in those days after Marcus died, too lost in his own guilt to process anything the Navy said to him. The citation reads as follows. Patterson's voice rose, formal now, carrying the weight of official recognition. For extraordinary heroism in action against the enemy while serving as team leader during combat operations in the Republic of Vietnam on November 23, 1970. Despite sustaining critical injuries during an ambush, Master Chief Whitmore refused evacuation and personally transported 3 wounded team members through 14 miles of enemy-controlled waters to the extraction point. His actions directly resulted in the survival of all 3 men and upheld the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The hall was silent. Every man and woman present understood what those words meant, what that swim had cost, what those 14 miles represented. Patterson stepped forward and pinned the Navy Cross to Earl's faded denim jacket. The medal looked incongruous against the worn fabric, a symbol of valor attached to the clothes of a man who had been invisible for half a century. This belongs to you. Patterson's voice was thick. It always belonged to you. You earned it in blood and water and sacrifice, and I am honored to finally place it where it should have been 54 years ago. Earl looked down at the medal on his chest. His vision blurred. His hand came up slowly, fingers brushing the cold metal. There should be another one. His voice broke. For Marcus. He is the one who deserves this. He gave everything. Patterson nodded. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for his actions that night. His medal was presented to his wife in a private ceremony in 1971. It now hangs in his granddaughter's home. Earl turned to look at Diana Webb. She was weeping openly, making no effort to hide her tears. She nodded once, confirming what Patterson had said. My grandmother kept it in a shadow box above the fireplace. Diana's voice was rough. It was the first thing I saw every morning growing up. My grandfather's medal. And next to it, a photograph of his team. You were in that photograph, Master Chief. You were standing right beside him. Earl's composure shattered completely. The tears came, and he did not try to stop them. 54 years of grief, of guilt, of loneliness poured out of him in waves that shook his entire body. Vernon caught him as his knees buckled. Diana was there a moment later, supporting his other side. Together, they held him upright as he wept for Marcus Webb, for the young man he had been, for the decades lost to guilt and shadows. The hall remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply bore witness to a man finally allowing himself to grieve, finally accepting that survival was not betrayal, that living was not a sin. When the tears finally slowed, when Earl could breathe again, Admiral Patterson was still standing in front of him. The Admiral's own eyes were wet. "Welcome home, Master Chief." Patterson extended his hand. "It is long overdue." Earl took the offered hand. His grip was weak, his fingers trembling, but the contact was real. Human. Alive. "Thank you, sir." His whisper was barely audible. "Thank you for finding me." Patterson shook his head. "You found yourself, Master Chief. You walked through that door tonight. All we did was recognize what was already there." He squeezed Earl's hand once more, then released it. "Now," the Admiral's voice carried a hint of warmth beneath the authority, "I believe there is paperwork to begin. A dead man coming back to life creates a significant amount of bureaucracy, but that can wait until tomorrow." He turned to address the hall. "Tonight, we celebrate. Tonight, we welcome home a warrior who has been lost for far too long. Tonight, Spectre rejoins the Brotherhood." The hall erupted in cheers. The celebration swirled around Earl like a current he could not quite navigate. Men approached to shake his hand, to offer words of respect, to simply stand in his presence for a moment before moving on. Women who had lost husbands and sons to wars they barely understood came to tell him that his story gave them hope. Young SEALs who had grown up on legends of Spectre asked questions with the reverence of disciples meeting a prophet. Earl accepted it all with the quiet grace that had defined him even before the guilt had hollowed him out. He shook hands. He nodded. He murmured responses that were barely audible, but somehow always right. And through it all, he kept touching the Navy Cross pin to his chest, as if confirming it was real. Vernon had not left his side. The one-armed man stood guard like a sentinel, managing the flow of well-wishers, creating space when Earl needed to breathe. 53 years of mourning had transformed into something else, something Vernon did not yet have words for. Joy was too simple. Relief was too small. It was something deeper, something that rewrote the story of his entire adult life. "You need to eat." Vernon's voice cut through the noise. "You said you came here for a meal. That plate of meatloaf is still sitting on your table, cold as a corpse." Earl almost smiled. The expression felt foreign on his face, muscles remembering movements they had not made in decades. "I'm not sure I could keep anything down right now." "Try." Vernon steered him back toward the corner table, which had been cleared of other occupants and now sat like a small island of calm in the chaos. Sarah Chun was already there, a fresh plate of food waiting. "I had the kitchen heat this up." She pushed the plate toward Earl as he sat. "You need to eat something. Your body has been through a shock tonight." Earl looked at the food. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes and green beans from a can. Institutional food. The same kind of meal he had eaten in mess halls and VA hospitals and homeless shelters for 54 years. But somehow, tonight, it looked different. It looked like something offered with love. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The food was mediocre at best, but he chewed and swallowed and took another bite. Vernon watched with satisfaction. Sarah Chun pretended not to watch at all. Diana Webb appeared at the table's edge. She had been fielding questions from Admiral Patterson's aides, handling the logistics of Earl's resurrection with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing chaos. "The Admiral wants to arrange transportation for you tonight." Diana sat down across from Earl. "A hotel room near the base. Somewhere comfortable while we sort out the paperwork." Earl shook his head. "I have a room above a laundromat on 16th Street. It is not much, but it is mine." Diana and Vernon exchanged glances. "Master Chief." Diana's voice was gentle. "That room is not appropriate anymore. You're not a ghost anymore. You do not have to live like one." Earl set down his fork. His hand found the knife in his pocket, fingers tracing the familiar shape. "I have lived alone for 54 years. The adjustment is going to take time. I cannot go from invisible to whatever this is in one night." Vernon leaned forward. "Nobody is asking you to, but you do not have to go back to that room tonight. You do not have to be alone." Earl looked at his old friend, at the man he had carried through a jungle, who had grown old believing Earl was dead, who had named his son after the ghost he mourned. Vernon's face was earnest, open, stripped of any agenda beyond simple human connection. Where would you have me go? My house. Vernon did not hesitate. Maria's been gone 3 years now. The place is too big for just me. I have a spare room that has been empty since Marcus Jr. moved out. It is yours if you want it, for as long as you want it. Earl's throat tightened. A home. A real home. Not a rented room above a laundromat. Not a shelter bed. Not a bridge underpass. A home with someone who knew him, who remembered who he had been, who wanted him there. I do not know if I can. Earl's voice cracked. I do not know if I remember how to be around people. You do not have to remember. Vernon reached across the table and gripped Earl's arm. You just have to show up. The rest will come. Sarah Chun spoke softly. He is right, Master Chief. Healing does not happen in isolation. It happens in community, in connection, in letting people carry you the way you carry them. Earl thought of the 14 miles, the weight of wounded men on his shoulders and his back, the burning in his lungs, the salt water in his wounds, the absolute certainty that he would die before he let any of them drown. He had carried them because that was what you did, because brothers did not leave brothers behind, and now they were offering to carry him. Diana leaned forward. My grandmother used to say something. She said that the hardest part of coming home is believing you deserve to be there. She said Marcus struggled with that too, before he deployed the final time. Survivor's guilt before he was even a survivor. Earl looked at her, at Marcus's blood, Marcus's legacy, sitting across from him and offering wisdom from beyond the grave. She said the only cure is acceptance. Not earning your place, not proving you deserve it, just accepting that the people who love you want you there, that your presence is enough. Earl's eyes burned. He blinked rapidly, fighting back tears he thought he had exhausted. I do not know if I can accept that. Diana smiled, a sad smile but real. You do not have to accept it tonight. You just have to take the first step. Go home with Vernon. Sleep in a real bed. Wake up tomorrow and see how it feels. The noise of the hall faded around them. Earl sat in a bubble of silence with these 3 people who had somehow become his anchors. Vernon, the brother he had saved and lost and found again. Sarah, the chaplain who had seen something worth saving in a hunched old man eating alone. Diana, the living proof that Marcus's legacy had continued, had flourished, had produced something beautiful. He thought of Marcus, of the last order his swim buddy had ever given him. Get the others home. Earl had spent 54 years believing he had fulfilled that order. But maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe the order was not just about that night in the South China Sea. Maybe it was about all the nights after. Maybe getting home was not just a destination. Maybe it was a process. A journey that took 54 years and ended in a VFW hall with a Navy Cross on his chest and an offer of a spare room. Okay. The word came out small, fragile, but real. Okay, Vernon. I will come home with you. Vernon's face split into a grin that took 20 years off his age. His grip on Earl's arm tightened. Good. That is good, Earl. Maria would have wanted this. She always said you were out there somewhere. She always believed. Earl picked up his fork and took another bite of meatloaf. It tasted better than anything he had eaten in 54 years. Because for the first time in 54 years, he was not eating alone. And for the first time in 54 years, he was going home. The crowd had begun to thin as the hour grew late. Families with children departed first, then the older veterans whose bodies demanded rest even when their spirits wanted to stay. But a core group remained, unwilling to leave while Spectre was still present, as if afraid he might vanish again the moment they looked away. Admiral Patterson had retreated to a corner with his aides, making phone calls and issuing quiet orders. The machinery of Earl's resurrection was already in motion. By morning, there would be meetings with Langley, conversations with the VA, discussions about back pay and benefits, and the 1,000 bureaucratic details that accompanied bringing a dead man back to life. Earl did not care about any of it. He sat at his corner table with Vernon and Diana and Sarah, the Navy Cross heavy on his chest, Marcus's knife warm in his pocket, and for the first time in 54 years, he felt something like peace. Reeves approached the table. The lieutenant commander had spent the last hour working security, turning away reporters, managing the crowd, doing everything in his power to be useful. Now he stood at the edge of the group, uncertain, his earlier arrogance replaced by something fragile and searching. Master Chief. Reeves's voice was hoarse. I know I already apologized, but I need to say something else. Earl looked up at him. The young officer's face was drawn, aged by the events of the evening. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there 3 hours ago. Go ahead, son. Reeves swallowed hard. I have been thinking about what you said, about looking closer, about not judging by appearance. And I realized something tonight. He paused, gathering himself. I have been so focused on protecting the Brotherhood from frauds that I forgot what the Brotherhood actually means. I forgot that the whole point is to take care of each other. Not just the ones who look the part. Not just the ones with the right credentials. All of us. Every veteran who walks through a door looking for help. Earl nodded slowly. That is a good lesson to learn. I want to do better. Reeves's voice cracked. I want to be the kind of leader who sees people, not just uniforms. Who asks questions before making accusations. Who remembers that every man has a story, even if he is not telling it. Then be that leader. Earl's voice was quiet but firm. You have the rank. You have the platform. Use them. Create something that helps instead of judges. Something that welcomes instead of challenges. Reeves blinked. Create something? Vernon leaned forward. There are programs for homeless veterans. Reintegration programs. Support groups. Most of them are overwhelmed and underfunded. A man with your connections could make a real difference. The idea seemed to land on Reeves like a weight, but not an unwelcome one. His shoulders straightened slightly, purpose flickering in his eyes. I could do that. He looked at Earl. Would you help me? Would you be willing to be part of something like that? Earl considered the question. 3 hours ago, he had been a ghost eating alone in a corner. Now he was being asked to help build something, to contribute, to matter. I do not know what help I could be. Earl's voice was honest. I am 78 years old. I have been invisible for half a century. I did not know anything about programs or funding or organization. You know what it feels like to be lost? Diana spoke up. You know what it feels like to carry guilt that is not yours to carry. You know what it feels like to think you do not deserve help. She leaned forward. That knowledge is worth more than any organizational skill. The men who need help the most are the ones who think they do not deserve it. They need to hear from someone who understands. Someone who has been where they are. Someone who found his way back. Earl looked at Marcus's granddaughter, at the fierce certainty in her eyes, at the legacy of her grandfather living on through her words. Marcus would have built something like this. Diana's voice softened. He was always the one who took care of the younger guys. Always the one who noticed when someone was struggling. He would have wanted this. The invocation of Marcus's name settled over the table like a benediction. Earl's hand found the knife in his pocket. He could almost hear Marcus's voice, that familiar drawl, offering encouragement the way he always had. Come on, Spectre. You have been hiding long enough. Time to get back in the fight. Earl closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted. Okay. The word came out stronger than before. I will help. I do not know what I can offer, but I will try. Reeves exhaled, relief flooding his features. Thank you, Master Chief. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Earl almost smiled. I have not done anything, but I will show up. That is all I can promise. I will show up. Vernon clapped his hand on Earl's shoulder. That is all any of us can do. Show up. Keep trying. Let other people help carry the load. Sarah Chin rose from her chair. It is getting late. We should get you home, Master Chief. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. Home. The word still felt strange on Earl's tongue. But when he looked at Vernon, at the genuine warmth in his old friend's eyes, it felt less impossible than it had an hour ago. The group rose together. Admiral Patterson approached, his calls finished, his aides trailing behind. Master Chief Whitmore. Patterson extended his hand. I will be in touch tomorrow to begin the formal process of reinstating your records. But tonight, I want you to know something. Earl shook the offered hand. The teams remember you. Patterson's voice carried the weight of official recognition and personal respect intertwined. Every man who has earned the Trident in the last 50 years has heard your name, has studied your operations, has tried to live up to the standard you set. You are not just a legend, Master Chief. You are a foundation. Everything we built on the shoulders of men like you." Earl did not know how to respond. The weight of those words pressed down on him, not crushing but grounding, anchoring him to a truth he had spent 54 years denying. He had mattered. His service had mattered. His survival had mattered. "Thank you, Admiral." Earl's voice was rough. "I will try to be worthy of that." Patterson shook his head. "You already are. You always were. The only one who did not know it was you." He released Earl's hand and stepped back. "Go home, Master Chief. Rest. Tomorrow, we start bringing you back to life." Earl nodded. He turned to find Vernon waiting, car keys in his remaining hand, a smile on his weathered face. "Ready?" Earl looked around the VFW hall one last time, at the photographs on the walls, at the flags hanging limp, at the faces of men and women who had welcomed him back from the dead. "Ready?" Earl took a breath. "Let's go home." They walked out together, Vernon and Earl side by side. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the salt smell of the nearby ocean. Somewhere in the darkness, the Atlantic rolled against the shore, the same waters that had swallowed so many secrets that had taken Marcus Webb 54 years ago. Earl paused at Vernon's car and looked up at the stars. "Still here, brother." He whispered the words to the darkness, to Marcus, to the man he had been before grief had unmade him. Still trying. And for the first time since November 23rd, 1970, he believed that trying might actually be enough. 6 months later, Earl Whitmore stood before the memorial wall at CIA headquarters in Langley. 113 stars carved into white marble, each one representing an officer who had died in service to the country. His star was there, 7th row, 3rd from the left. It had been there for 54 years, marking a death that never happened. Vernon stood beside him, as he had every week for 53 years. But this time, Earl was not a ghost being mourned. He was a living man visiting his own memorial. The agency had offered to remove the star. Earl had refused. "It belongs to someone." Earl's voice was quiet in the hushed space. "It belongs to the man I was before. The man who died in the South China Sea with Marcus. That man is gone. Let the star remember him." Vernon nodded slowly. He understood. Some deaths were not about bodies. Some deaths were about the people we stopped being. The Book of Honor sat in its glass case nearby, the names of those whose identities could be revealed inscribed in careful calligraphy. Earl's name had been added 3 months ago, with a notation that he had been discovered alive after 54 years. It was the first time in the agency's history that a star had been given an asterisk. They walked out together into the spring sunshine. The world was green and alive, cherry blossoms drifting on the warm breeze. Earl breathed deep, filling his lungs with air that no longer tasted like guilt. The last 6 months had been a resurrection in every sense. Vernon's spare room had become Earl's home. The Navy had reinstated his records, processed his back pay, restored his benefits. Admiral Patterson had personally overseen the paperwork, cutting through decades of bureaucratic tangles with the determination of a man on a mission. But the real transformation had happened in quieter ways. Earl had started attending a support group for combat veterans at the VA. He had resisted at first, sitting in the back, saying nothing, just listening. But eventually, inevitably, someone had asked him to share. And once he started talking, he found he could not stop. He told them about Marcus, about the South China Sea, about the 54 years of wandering. He told them about the guilt that had eaten him alive, the conviction that surviving was a betrayal, the prison he had built inside his own mind. And when he finished, when the room was silent and wet-eyed, a young Marine with burns across half his face had spoken up. "I thought I was the only one." The young man's voice had cracked. "I thought I was the only one who felt like surviving was wrong." Earl had looked at him, at this boy who had been through his own hell, who was carrying his own impossible weight. "You are not alone." Earl's words had come from somewhere deep, somewhere he had thought was dead. None of us are alone. That is the lie that guilt tells us, that we are the only ones, that no one can understand. But look around this room. Look at these faces. We all understand. We all carry the same weight. The young Marine had wept, and Earl had held him, this stranger who was not a stranger at all, this brother he had never met. That moment had been the beginning of something new. Reeves had kept his promise. With Earl's guidance and Vernon's connections and Diana's organizational skills, they had built a program. Not a bureaucracy, not a system, just a network of veterans helping veterans, meeting in VFW halls and church basements and living rooms across Virginia. They called it the Spectre Initiative over Earl's objections. "You're the proof it works," Reeves had told him. "You are the proof that no one is too far gone, that coming home is possible even after 54 years. Let them use your name. Let them have that hope." So Earl had relented. And now, 6 months later, the initiative had helped 43 veterans find housing, helped 27 navigate the VA system, helped 16 reconnect with families they had abandoned, helped 3 step back from the edge of bridges they had been ready to jump from. Earl did not run the program. He did not have the skills for that. But he showed up. Every week, he showed up at meetings and sat with men who reminded him of himself. Men who thought they were ghosts. Men who thought they did not deserve to be helped. He told them his story. He showed them his star on the wall and the Navy Cross on his chest and the corroded knife in his pocket. He showed them that survival was not betrayal, that living was not a sin, that the men they had lost would want them to keep going. Some of them listened. Some of them came back the next week. Some of them started the long journey home. Earl could not save all of them. He knew that. Some wounds were too deep, some guilt too heavy, some ghosts too strong. But everyone he reached, every man who started to believe that coming home was possible, felt like a small repayment of a debt he had been carrying for half a century. Diana Webb had become something like a daughter to him. She visited every Sunday, bringing food her grandmother used to make, recipes passed down through generations. They would sit on Vernon's porch and talk about Marcus, about the man he had been, about the legacy he had left. Earl told her stories she had never heard, details that had never been written down. She recorded them all, preserving her grandfather's memory in a way that official reports never could. The knife still rested in Earl's pocket. He had considered giving it to Diana, returning it to the Webb family where it belonged. But she had refused. "He gave it to you," she had said firmly. "He wanted you to have it, to carry it, to remember him. Keep it, Master Chief. Keep it until you do not need it anymore." Earl was not sure that day would ever come, but the weight of it felt different now. Less like a burden, more like a companion. Now, standing in the spring sunshine outside Langley, Earl looked at Vernon and smiled. The expression still felt unfamiliar on his face, but it was getting easier. "Same time next week?" Vernon asked. Earl nodded. "Same time next week. But first we have a meeting. There's a new guy, 23 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan. His wife left him, and he has been living in his car for 6 months." Vernon's face softened. "Poor kid. He reminds me of someone." Earl's hand found the knife in his pocket. "He reminds me of me." They walked to Vernon's car together, 2 old warriors moving through a world that had tried to forget them. But Earl was done being forgotten. He was done being a ghost. He was done letting guilt write the story of his life. Marcus had ordered him to get the others home. For 54 years, Earl had thought that order had been fulfilled in the South China Sea. But now he understood. The order had never been about one night. It had been about every night after. Every veteran lost in the wilderness of their own guilt. Every brother who needed someone to carry them. Get the others home. That was the mission. That had always been the mission. And Earl Whitmore, call sign Spectre, was finally ready to complete it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us in faces we might not recognize, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments below, who is the quiet hero in your life? Who is the person carrying a weight that nobody sees? Sometimes the greatest warriors are not the ones still wearing the uniform. They're the ones who laid it down and carried the burden alone. But no one has to carry alone. That is what Earl learned. That is what the brotherhood means. Thank you for watching. And remember, it is never too late to come home. "Still here, brother." Earl whispered the words as Vernon started the car. Still trying. And now, finally, he was not trying alone.